you very much, and it's absolutely fantastic to be in front of all of you. Uh, 25 years ago, you look at Indian pharma industry, there weren't many things that we could have said that we did. I think the ministers aptly described in terms of where we were. But now, for example, amongst you can clearly see the strides that we've made, whether it's in vaccine and including vaccine development in India, contributing to the rest of the world, whether it's in terms of US FDA sites, the number 2 across the world outside the United States. So there have been many strides done, including helping both our own countrymen as well as people from outside. So, but this panel is I'm really privileged to sort of moderate this panel. We've got 4 exceptional CEOs, and we'll hear about some of their perspectives as well. So I thought first just to start with, I'm going to just do a very brief introduction of all of them. Sridhar. Sridhar is the managing director of Pfizer India. He is a chartered accountant and has successfully steered many strategic projects, global brand launches, business restructuring actions, mergers and acquisitions, and joint ventures. Sridhar is also the president of the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India and the chair of its finance and taxation work group. He is the former chair of the FICCI Pharma Committee, and in this capacity, he has effectively advocated for policies that are pro-patient, encourage innovation, and provide for a positive environment for the industry to grow. Next to Sridhar is Gagandeep Singh from AstraZeneca. He is the country president and managing director of AstraZeneca and is responsible for driving AstraZeneca's science-led strategy in India. He has studied economics and began his career in merchant banking. Prior to this role, Gagan was appointed as the country president for AstraZeneca Philippines. Post a successful stint in his role, he moved to the United Kingdom as the global head of established brands. Next to me is Sanjiv. Sanjiv is the CEO and MD of Bharat Serums and Vaccines Limited. He is a widely recognized and acknowledged professional in the pharmaceutical and healthcare domain. In his diverse career span of 30 years, Sanjiv has experienced entrepreneurship and also served on the board of Johnson & Johnson, Private Limited India, and Fulford India. Recently, Sanjiv was recognized as one of the top 100 business leaders in Asia for 2022 by the Economic Times. He served as the vice president of OPPI, been a chairman of AmCham Pharma Committee, and apart from these commendations, he served on the academic board of NMMIS Pharma Management, IES Management School, and IIHMR. And sitting in the middle is Vani Manja. Vani Manja is the country managing director of Boehringer Ingelheim, India. Her global experience in healthcare spans nearly 2 decades across McKinsey & Company, Becton Dickinson, and Boehringer Ingelheim, and is characterized by strong global mobility and cross-functional leadership assignments across healthcare and management consulting. Prior to embarking on her international career, she also served as a commissioned officer in the Indian Army. That is. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much. Maybe Sanjiv, I'm going to start with you. When we look at India's pharma sector, really, it's in terms of volume, it's the 3rd largest by volumes. But when we look at the value, it's 14th in terms of value. Therefore, it's a given that we need to move up the value chain, focus on more innovative drugs. Having said that, the development time for new drugs takes anywhere between 10 to 12 years. The conversion of targets from approval to clinical trials to approval is nearly 20:1. This also reflects in the R&D spend, right, in terms of what pharma and patient statistics. So India's pharma industry contributes about 24% on all of the R&D spend, but in terms of patents, it's probably only 5%. That's where we are. What I wanted to know was really in your views of how do we move up the value chain? I mean, we talked about being the pharmacy for the world. How do we move up the value chain? And in terms of, given this high risk, because there is a long gestation period and capital spend, is there any support that you think is needed? But more importantly, how do we sort of really move up the value chain?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Romal. I think this is a question on the minds of the industry, on the minds of academic institutions, on the minds of the government, I think everywhere, and the minister spoke about it in the right frame. There is on one hand, the ambition of the country to be playing a much bigger role in the global healthcare and pharmaceutical market. And to that extent, we cannot remain where we are. I think we should stop trying to be very, very proud of being pharmacy of the world and start trying to build pride in trying to be the R&D of the world. I think that's a very important moment that we need to move psychologically. But beyond that, I think you're right that we have started to build a much better ecosystem now. I think I'll give you a few examples. I think industry academia collaboration was always something which was talked about and never done. There is much more happening today with NCL, ISCR, and ICMR and all getting engaged with companies. The contracting with companies is getting a much more easier route than what it was in the past. So that's an important development. So because ultimately, if you see successful R&D countries in the world in healthcare, have basically a very strong industry academia collaboration. It's getting better. Is it there where it should be? Absolutely not. I think it needs a much more encouraging atmosphere to ensure that these things get better. We have tried a few, and it's starting to work better. Let me put it this way: it's starting to work a little better. Second comes, I think, wherever you see the role of government institutions in trying to provide support is very high. Whether you take the way NIH works with either the universities or the companies, I think there's a lot more that happens in UK, for example. A lot more happens there. So if you see that, I think the government of India started recently a lot more on production linked or manufacturing linked schemes. And when the PLI scheme for our industry came about, we gave this feedback that look, this is okay, but this is not going to work anywhere to make India something special. Yeah, you cannot just create manufacturing sites and think that we will be something special in the world. What we need is more encouragement towards doing basic R&D. And with this, a lot of discussion happening from even OPPI as well as the other associations. The government has started to move there. I think what is being now discussed as a research linked incentive scheme is probably taking much better shape today. As as we are aware of a few things, we can say that this is starting to take some good shape. So the basis, we have to check how this basis works, but the whole idea that this capital is always at risk when you do R&D is understood. Incentives have to be created. Now those incentives have to be in which form or shape is something that is being discussed. Earlier, there used to be a income tax weightage on 200% weightage on R&D expenses and all, but probably the government thinks it is it's not the right framework of trying to give incentives. So I think they're thinking to a little bit deeper in terms of what we've also encouraged government in our feedback to think that R&D is not just about labs and work in the labs. It's also about how do we establish collaborations outside India. It's also about how do we create a regulatory corridor between Indian government regulatory agencies and US, Japan, EMA. How do we create those regulatory agencies so that there are very difficult discussions for Indian companies to have with these regulators. The big pharma knows it well because they have experienced it for a much longer time, and therefore they know how these discussions go. I'll give you an example. Today, the whole biologic space is exploding, and both EMA and US FDA is trying to get much more open compared to what they were. So how do we create that regulatory corridor? That's something as a feedback we have given the government. On the companies themselves, I think we have been, as industry, also at times complacent that since we have good business, we are able to manufacture generics at a good quality and supply. It was good business. But probably as companies have started to reach a particular scale, they are realizing that henceforth, growing beyond that scale is well nigh impossible if we do not get into good R&D. And therefore, that R&D expense that we used to talk about today was basically bioequivalent studies in India. And that R&D expense is getting a little better in terms of actually doing basic R&D. The other point that I think, the last point that I have is that the startup ecosystems started with diagnostics, started with devices basically, and this is where a lot of things are coming to fruition as we see. But probably one step further, we are now starting to see some smart medicine efforts being done in kind of in the R&D space in startups, which is another good development. So all this put together, if sustained well and if incentivized properly by the government, could lead to something better. We only stand a chance if this succeeds to go up the value chain in the world.
Great. Thank you, Sanjiv. Thank you very much. And maybe Sridhar, I'll pick on that one what Sanjiv mentioned in terms of R&D. So maybe could you paint a landscape in terms of what really needs for us to be cutting edge in terms of R&D, the overall ecosystem, and I'll also pick on the topic which Sanjeev mentioned about research linked incentives as well. So what kind of incentives from a RLI could be there and what time frame should be there? But first, more to painting the landscape on R&D.
Thank you, Romal, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be out here today. Very interesting question, and I'm so very happy when in the last conference, when we went for the FIGI conference, the health minister said, let's look at a vision 25 years down the line. Let's not look at it for today. That is a starting point of futuristic thinking. Till yesterday, we've been thinking about solving for today's or yesterday's problem. The first time I'm seeing we are looking at very, very ahead of the curve thing. And of course, R&D plays a very, very important role out here. Unlike a production linked incentive scheme, which is very easy to roll out because based on production, research linked is very, very complicated. Now, before you even get into research linked incentive scheme, it is important that certain fundamentals are put in place to encourage people to think of innovation. Fundamentally, few things. We need to really, really strengthen our IP landscape. We need to give confidence to every entrepreneur in the country here today that when you discover a molecule, it is yours, including data protection and yours, so that the person doesn't look behind and say, once I submit my data, will somebody else fast track? That's what happened in India today. There is no real protection. Therefore, any entrepreneur, when you're going to invest billions of dollars on research, if there's a nervousness of somebody else leveraging the data, there's always nervousness. So third, fundamentally, as a country, we need to go towards a system of really bringing up patent laws and data protection to the next level so that every entrepreneur is confident of investment. That's number one. Second, our regulatory system needs to really transform to global standards because we are going to make products not for India, but for the global world. So today we need to be part of, seen as Indian companies have to be part of our regulatory system and part of ICH, which are global regulatory standards, which then automatically streamlines the way we do regulatory filing, the way clinical trials are done, the way the approval process are happening. So what that means is, just as Dr. Sudhakar said, we have got significant US FDA plants in the country today. Can we also similarly focus on the regulatory landscape required so that we are able to compete and say our regulatory standards are as good as any other regulatory standards? If you get these two things corrected, what is really required is we are too fragmented as an industry for each company to really invest billions of dollars in R&D. Unlike global companies who have got scale and the global presence, for them, R&D is another department of business. Commercial business on one hand, R&D is a parallel business we have. We invest on it for a long-term future because we believe if we do not invest in R&D, the commercial business will drop. So mindset of us should be, we are not just the pharmacy of the world. We want to be the pharma market of the world. So it's not just about trying to say which product is going off LOE and therefore what we should do. That's a very, very important thing because we need to feed the people today. But also, how do we really become the pharma market of the world? And therefore, government has to create that, encourage the funding because no Indian entrepreneur has the ability to fund billions of dollars. For example, we spoke about R&D. That is a very, what we can say is, all people having ideas on innovation, get your project pre-approved by the government. Have a SEC, just as a SEC committee for drug regulation, have a SEC committee for approving new drug launches. We have got brilliant scientists, brilliant technocrats in our government who can say, this idea makes sense to us. We will approve a weighted deduction for this specific idea. And then you can actually track it in phases and say, if you complete your phase 1, there's a deduction, phase 2. So you're actually making it a little bit, rather than saying all R&D gets it, specifically focus on discovery. You create a discovery-led R&D incentive for tax purposes. That's one. Second, what is really required is a long-term funding, because R&D takes 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Some will fail, some will not fail. The entrepreneurs need to have access to long-term capital bonds at a virtually at a very, very minimal interest rate, specially designed. This also can be approved by the central government based on a panel who understands expert. Third is, we need to make sure we get some global experts on a permanent panel of a R&D center out here. There are lots of scientists in global world who spend years and years doing research. Let's get them on our retainer as a government of India and say, you are permanent member, partner with global institutes, and then create the ecosystem which enables to support all the Indian companies to say, this innovation of yours makes sense to you, and back it up with very strong long-term capital bonds to really make it happen. And more importantly, and lastly, if it is a very bold move, can Government of India create a special purpose vehicle only for supporting drug investments and put a skin in the game along with bonds and capital investments? The Government of India, the SPV, can exit it after a successful venture, but then what happens is the entrepreneurs also seem to be supported to say, don't have to worry about tomorrow's leg of funding because I have this series of funding. It could be a combination of private equity supported, government supported, company supported. You create a SPV, and then that SPV invest in this innovation, and therefore you give a lot of confidence to the innovator saying, you're not alone there, go discover it. If it succeeds, everything can work in better. So we have to be a little bit bolder in trying to really make it. That's the only way we can take a chance of this. We have to catch up with what the global world has done earlier.
Thank you, Sridhar. Discovery-linked incentives, and I think some really good suggestions of how we could take this to the next level. So Gagan, if I can come across to you. Indian drug manufacturers launch about 300 to 350 new brands annually, but they're mostly repurposed or combination of drugs. There have been tie-ups, obviously, with global pharma majors for development and launch, including yours, as we've seen during the COVID period. Given that 50% of India pharma industry is actually sales as exports, how easy has it been for India to scale up and launch new products outside India? And we're obviously known for frugal innovation, and there are initiatives like Genome Valley. We spoke about the Genome Valley thing. But what more needs to be done given the global leadership position that we're trying to achieve?
Thank you, Romal. And first of all, a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me over. Really an important question and quite linked with what we've been just discussing, because one of the things you realize is that we are, in a sense of the word, also decoupled from the world. When we look at our market is a branded generic market. What we export is generic medicine. So therefore, our opportunity has a certain amount of delivery, but it also has a certain amount of ceiling because of the fact that at the end of the day, there is a replacement of a drug which goes through exclusivity, which happens with our drug. And to a point, we can do that, and we have a very, very strong market share. Today, 1 in 5 pills is made out of India, but these are all at the value chain where you're largely playing into the generic segment of things, which is a great achievement. And we heard Dr. Sudhakar talk about where we were in 60s, 70s to where we are today, completely Atmanirbhar, on the top of that, exporting across the world. But if we were to play with the lens like Sridhar mentioned, let's talk about 2047, our 100th year of independence. What is the journey going to look like? What is the opportunity emerging globally? So I think there are 3 layers of opportunity which emerge. One of them also was touched upon by Dr. Sudhakar on biologics. We're looking at even next 5 years, about 70 billion of drugs which will go off patent. Now, these are complex molecules. These require support, manufacturing. We need to scale ourselves in terms of skill as well as in terms of our ability to really produce and the capacity to do that. But this is an available opportunity in the short term, low-hanging fruit. I think the next layer of opportunity which is available is the CDMO. Now, that's complex manufacturing, and India stands at a great sweet spot to be part of the critical manufacturing of patented drugs and play that role through the CDMO. You're talking about today the market being 160 billion, next 10 years will be 230 to 40 billion, and India has one of the lowest costs of doing CDMO. Our EBITDA margins are much better than what you see in the West. We're at about 25-30%, West is about 15 or 20%. So that talks about the talent which is available to play. And then the last part of the journey is really looking at how do we scale up and start playing in the global branded market, which is where you need research based incentives, which we spoke about, which is where you need contribution to come through as an ecosystem. But I personally have you know, thought that India has the potential today to be part of that global branded market by about at least 20% of our market globally could be out of India. And that's I think the huge opportunity. Today we're part of 20% of the generic market, but we could be part of the 20% of the branded market. I think the last bit I'll probably say is the brilliance that we have is in terms of the frugal innovation that you touched upon is that if India innovates, the world can benefit. And I think that is what is the responsibility with us, because we can do this R&D at a far lower cost, and something which can address needs not only of the developed world but also of the emerging world. And that is also our responsibility given the talent and the ecosystem that we have. So I think we are at a sweet spot as long as we can move towards it, and my eminent colleagues have shared the path towards it. So I really look forward to 2047.
Absolutely, Gagan. Vani, coming across to you, globally, pharma companies have made big strides in innovation, right? Moving from mass to personalized therapies with treatment like cell and gene therapy, right? And going forward, obviously, patient centricity and value-based care are becoming central themes that will drive innovation. So, in this context, what is the opportunity for India? And the second question is also when we consider other countries, and especially take China, and Gagan, I'll come to you in terms of Korea as well, that what we spoke about. How have they been incentivizing R&D, right? Are there any learnings from those countries as well that we can actually take forward as we build and scale our R&D companies?
I think, first of all, thank you for having me here as well. It's a pleasure to be here with a fantastic group of panelists. Important topic, and as you said, Romal, in the last couple of years especially, the spotlight has been pretty strongly on pharma, biopharma, on the art of what is possible in times of crisis, especially when multiple stakeholders come together to solve for the agenda at hand, be it around accelerating, as you said, Dr. Sudhakar, the pathways for drug and vaccine development from decades to months, if you will, around collaborations for licensing, expanding manufacturing capacity, and increasing access. India has played a key role in this, and I think it's a matter of pride for all of us, for the country having risen to the occasion with the capabilities at hand. And therefore, the next chapter, as we've all discussed now through 2047, is going from being the supplier of medicines to truly bringing innovation and R&D to India. In the 2047 blueprint, a few highlights that the Union Minister of Health and Family Welfare articulated is one, to move beyond manufacturing leadership to also innovation and R&D leadership. Two, absolute focus on the importance of collaboration, not only industry academia, but industry science and governments. And three, a pretty clear nod to the need for a balanced and sustainable policy and regulatory framework. All of these are important, and some of the panelists have talked about it. Maybe picking the question you had around what China has done along these themes, a few critical areas. I think the early focus of the Chinese regulatory reform started in the 80s, as you alluded to, but a large part of that, like in our past, has been focused on making China a manufacturing powerhouse, which they succeeded. I think the next chapter of policy reforms came in the mid-2010s, so quite recently, in terms of regulatory reforms to invite innovation and make China an innovation hub. 5 aspects I'd pick which connect also with what you said, Sridhar. One, bringing regulatory framework with international standards, ICH. Within this, much greater transparency. Second, regulatory pathways that are accelerated to accelerate approvals. Third, making sure import regulations are managed such that innovation, when it requires to be imported to the country, is supported so that there is a consistency. Fourth, importantly, we didn't talk about it, with the extent of manufacturing that happens in India, also overall drug quality controls through processes to ensure quality and audits and inspections, because there's a big question mark also on the quality of drugs that are produced and the ability to rely on those quality topics. And I'll come back to it later in a different context as well. Most importantly, an IPR ecosystem with protection measures, including what they did in the 2010s, 2015, 16, is going forward with patent linkage, such that the patent exclusivity of innovators was ensured through the life cycle of the patent. Beyond regulatory reforms, access to funding for an innovation was critical, which Sridhar alluded to also as well, both in terms of state funding as well as FDI and private equity venture capital funding, which I think we are well in our way to make that possible. Lastly, capability in the innovation value chain. I think Dr. Sudhakar referred to some of the tech parks that many state governments also are encouraging putting in place. And I think that will also go a long way. Looking at what's already being done, I think India is well on its way. It's about A, making it sustainable, making it consistent, and taking it to the next level so that in the next 25 years, we move from where we are today to truly bringing innovation, pharma, biotech, as well as the health tech startup sector.
Great. Thanks, Vani. And maybe, Gagan, if I'd like you to add on the Korea or your own experience with some of the other countries as well. I think that's an important one as we look to our investments coming into India.
Yeah, I think Korea is an example of a country which moved from entirely dependent on imports to someone today who's seen as a powerhouse in biotech. And a couple of things which Vani touched upon, they did extremely well. But in addition to that, I think one of their biggest investments has been in terms of academia. I mean, they produce more PhDs per capita than anyone else in the world. So that itself, helped through. Their emphasis on science technology early in schools, walking people through the whole process was really important, as well as having a country-led vision. Today, if you look at some of the names like Samsung Biologics or others, and you look at their market cap, it can actually be a big eye opener for all of us to see what this country is achieving. So I personally believe it's an example which is potentially worth emulating, because they come with similar constraints, they come with similar challenges, and they've been able to overcome. I think one critical aspect that you see in countries which move up the innovation value chain has always been that the domestic market is very vibrant and worth from an investment perspective. And I'll touch upon the point which Sridhar touched, that why would a billionaire invest? And very recently I heard one of the leading captains of the Indian industry talk about it. And he said, look, the largest brand in India, which is a innovative brand, is about 1,000 crores. And that's not a scale with which you can really invest, billions of dollars towards R&D and expect returns. So I think that's an area which we need to focus upon to make sure that our own industry. So today, if you look at which are the places which innovate the most in the world, whether it's United States, whether it's Japan, now Korea, China, all of them have a very, very vibrant domestic industry, which is really helping people recover a significant part of the risk capital that they put in innovation.
Thanks, Gagan.
Romal, just to add, I think Japan is another great example, consistent with Korea, maybe a chapter before, of two-step approach to a change in policy regulatory framework in the 1990s, 2000s first, which I think brought forth the first phase, and more recently, even as recently as 2014, 15, when there was a recognition of bringing the balance between continuing to encourage foster innovation, local and global, while also balancing, as mentioned, this is a challenge we are looking at in India, the topic of patient access and price measures. So finding that balance has been also something that Japan has moved very well.
Vani, I'll come back to you on other questions. So, and it's also linked to our summit, Smart Summit, Smart Pharma, right? So, pharma companies are taking various digital initiatives, right, in terms of emissions, cost, quality, right? So, this obviously becomes an important focus given our global aspirations. And you see IoT is being used on the shop floor, proof of concepts are being used on AI ML models. In terms of R&D, there's blockchain being evaluated for traceability and delivery, and important given that there is an estimate that 10 to 20% of all the drugs in India are actually fake as well, so those are more important. So, how do you see adoption of technology in the pharma industry in this context of this? How do you see that change?
So, pertinent topic also today. I'll pick up with first the supply chain management systems because that's where you started, including the topic of drug quality, including inventory management and supply chain management is a great opportunity, especially when we talk about products with drug supply considerations, given how globally reliant we are on supply chains to be managed. Within this specifically, how can we use, for example, track and trace mechanisms to ensure not only that drug supplies are secured and ensured, and we're able to track inventory, but also in the but also, this could help with manage the menace of counterfeits. If there are ways to label, track, and trace with non-replicable labels, drugs such that the quality can be confirmed through smart codes, etc. This is something that can help mitigate. It won't solve it, but it can help mitigate it. Of course, to actually manage the counterfeits better, other policies might be required, which I'll come to in a minute. Also, think about the possibility of using this data at the patient level, de-identified, of course. How do we use the big data from the supply chain automation, if you will, to figure out what's happening at the patient level, to be able to support patients better with patient support programs, understand them better, and even helping with the topics of adherence, which continue to be a problem, especially in the chronic disease arena. Coming to counterfeits, of course, I think more will need to be done beyond the smart technologies, be it track and trace, AI, and blockchain, again, might be possible in biologics. In chronic diseases with mass drugs, it may be much harder. So additional measures might be required, which I think the government is looking at. Just, I think, 3 months ago, March 22, the government has initiated, central government has initiated discussions with the DCGI on a task force for how to get rid of counterfeits and spurious drugs in the Indian value chain. As you said, 10, 20+% is large quantities, which is ideally clearly not good from an investment protection perspective, but most importantly from a patient protection, be it around drug quality, counterfeits, which might still have the drug, also spurious drugs, needs to be addressed, and we hope progress continues on this topic. Coming back to the opportunity with data and digital, let's look a little bit upstream on R&D. Yeah, significant opportunity, and I think my peers would agree, most of the multinational pharma are investing significantly in this arena, be it around advanced analytics and cloud computing to accelerate drug discovery and development, a lot of discussion around in silico discovery and development to speed up the process rather than spending too much time just in the clinic, using the vast amounts of patient data also to accelerate the drug candidate selection process, as a few examples. The next frontier might be quantum computing. Just last year, about 18 months ago, Boehringer Ingelheim Global announced a partnership with Google around experimenting with quantum computing in R&D use cases to help speed up and accelerate drug discovery and development. Beyond R&D, manufacturing and supply chain management, closer to the market, closer to the patient and the physician, there might be multiple opportunities, which all of us, I'm sure, are exploring in the global context, which I think with the very vibrant startup ecosystem in India, we could also leverage the capabilities and talent to initiate and trigger here, as Sanjiv was alluding to earlier, such as with all the data available through smart devices, through social media on patients, can we take this big data for better disease prediction as a starting point? What diseases to expect based on patient profiles, genetic profiles, etc., or for digital detection and monitoring of therapies. We've talked a lot about digital diagnostics in any case, which is pretty active and vibrant. And in the US right now, much investments are also being made in digital therapeutics. Yeah? How do we use digital therapeutics to help patients? We truly manage holistic healthcare. Simple things like adherence, which is a here and now, but also thinking about holistic digital therapeutics and digital care of patients. So the opportunities are many. And I think in the Indian context, as we look at future investments, if we can reach the next level of R&D investments, multinationals typically speak in the tune of 20%-ish of healthcare net sales feeding back into R&D. If you're able to think about investments to that tune, I think there is much opportunity to leverage these future possibilities with data digital to truly upgrade end-to-end the pharma ecosystem for patient health.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vani. And clearly, there is a linkage between India being pharmacy of the world, pharmacy marketing of the world, and AI/ML capital of the world as well, because we've moved from the IT BPO industry to really moving to the next level in terms of the IT value chain. So, yeah, absolutely.
And this is where the multidisciplinary dialogue becomes even richer, right? It's not just about health tech and healthcare and industry, academia, and government, but it's also about the tech industry. How do we connect that? Yeah.
Absolutely. Sridhar, so coming across to you, there are about 374 drugs on the national list of essential medicines. There is a resulting capped prices, and the ceiling price is linked to a wholesale price index. The non-scheduled drugs have a linkage, up to a hike limit of 10%. So, the Indian Pharmaceutical Association has been asking the government to extend this 10% hike to scheduled drugs as well. Right. So, what are the concerns that the industry has, and how important is a flexible pricing strategy going to be for the growth of the sector?
I'm going to answer this question with the theme of this conference in mind. Okay. When you call it a pricing policy, it's regressive. It's going back to centuries. And if you look at our current pricing policy, it was created with certain intent. It served its intent beautifully. But if you want to really look at healthcare for the future, I don't think we should anymore call it the pricing policy. What do we require? We require an environment to serve the patients without having a fear of trying to say what is going to happen tomorrow. We need a stable policy environment. So how do you bring the policy environment? I'm going to answer this question in three parts. Let's change the name of the pricing policy and let it bring it under the ambit of universal healthcare for the future and say every Indian will have access to quality medicine. Let's take that as the principle and say we're going to enable through a policy to have every individual, more so over the next 10 years, people at the lower income level, the lower middle income and poor income as the first priority to get better access. So let's change the pricing policy to access policy. Okay, that's number one. Now, how do you do that there? Let's not really look at one pricing policy which you bring in a price control, which actually benefits people like us. When the price of a drug comes down, when I was paying 10 rupees yesterday, I am able to pay at 6 rupees. I have benefited. But the person who couldn't even pay the 6 rupees is not able to get that medicine. So our pricing policy should be driven to people who cannot afford the medicine and access to it, and moving away from a one price fits all kind of approach. That's what we meant by pricing. I'll break it into 3 solutions. I do believe that Janaushadhi is a beautiful concept. Today, 1.3 billion population, people don't get medicine, access to medicine. We need to completely remodel our Janaushadhi scheme. Number one, let's make Janaushadhi scheme not just a generic medicine store, but also have other healthcare related products. What is going to happen is the shopkeeper is going to make a little bit extra margin so that he's able to run a business and not struggling with the 6 or 8% margin on a low value generic medicine. He doesn't make money there. Okay. That will also create more patients coming into the Janaushadhi stores. The footfall is going to increase. Second, let's open up Janaushadhi stores in lower tier geographies, in rural markets as a strategy and not into the main metro cities. Create a 50% reservation for all MSME companies. The demand is going to be so very high, no one single sector can manage it. So create a 50% reservation for MSME companies. So all the smaller companies, everybody can continue to make it because they're all very fragmented. The balance 50%, identify the drugs which are essential under the NLEM list and say which are the big pharma companies making those drugs. Because today if we look at Janaushadhi, no big pharma plays it because the pricing is too very low. Open up the balance 50% and enter into a long-term contract with those companies having scale to operate. Not every year tendering. The reason I'm saying is, if I have to really look at, say, a leading product that is supplied to Janaushadhi, I need guarantee of volumes, I need pricing, I need term. So rather than saying every year tender, have a 5-year contract with those companies saying, this molecule, you have scale to operate, we want to invest in scale manufacturing, give us regular supply. The biggest problem today in Janaushadhi is supply, continuity. So have that segment between MSME you can supply on a regular basis to a long-term contract with the big pharma companies for a 5-year period. So big pharma companies can invest in capacity to manufacture and they know they got a 5-year contract and keep supplying these molecules. So you can decide out of this 300 molecules, these companies have capability. You can still tendering with those big pharma companies. Whoever gets the tender does it, but at least then you're assured of a quality of science. So really recast Janaushadhi for the futuristic supply. Second thing is, let's look at our government system of procurement and payment. Because government at the end of the day procures and gives it free to either all the poor people or the government employees. Let government say, we are just not going to buy generic medicine. We also want to start treating treatments for today and tomorrow. And hence, we want all kinds of molecules, innovative and generics in our portfolio because every patient should get all kinds of medicines. Try and get into a negotiated contract with innovative companies to say, okay, fine. Rather than saying, I want to give price control on patented products, say for all government supplies, let's do a negotiated pricing agreement. What is going to happen is, people like us will be able to have, that's how it happens in global companies, because global markets, where the government buys for their purposes, then the companies are assured of a pricing and quantity and volume, and it's a negotiated price. If we were to sell directly to the government, we don't sell directly to the government at all today. Straight away, 30% margin is available. We can discount a product by 30% because there is no trade channel involved. The reason we don't do that is because the getting money from the government takes a lot more time. If the government can say, negotiated pricing, you supply directly to us, we will give you payment within 90 days. In case you don't get payment in 90 days, partner with State Bank of India to encash your bills, and the government can settle the bills with State Bank of India. So that way, all big companies are given a guarantee of payment and a cash flow happening. And you say, okay, 30% trade margin, what more can you give? Technically, straight away, by giving a price to the government, we can reduce the prices by close to 50%. So there'll be a 50% difference between what the private market is, government market is, because the government is paying to give it free to the patients. So we all should be able to give innovative medicines to the government for its own program. That way, you're going to enable access to innovative medicines and not generic medicines to government, and you don't need a pricing policy for it. Thirdly, our pricing policy needs to go beyond just drugs. If we are dreaming of new healthcare, new next generation, imagine 2047 or even prior to that, we can, any patient, any person, however poor he is able to walk in to any hospital of choice, government or private. The national health card which is available is color coded on his income or her income capacity. The person walks in and say, this is your color code, this is the cost of a treatment. It is a tiered treatment cost across all hospitals, quality being the same. So when Apollo Hospital is able to treat the patients with different paying capacity because the rates for those treatments have been capped based on the person's paying capacity. You will not get this right today. We've got enough techniques to color code income level over the next 10 years. Credit card payments, salary incomes, ration cards. We can actually go to a process of color coding it and make a person walk in and feel valued saying, I have an option to choose because we are out-of-pocket market. It is the private investment which is driving healthcare. And therefore, even the private hospitals required a differential pricing because they should be allowed to price their services differently based on able capacity. So when you do this differential pricing for treatment protocols, hospitalization, separate access pricing for negotiated contract with the government, revamping Jan Aushadhi, you don't need a price control. You've resolved most of your problems because you're not solving pricing, you're solving access. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Sridhar. I know we've got just 4 or 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask quick couple of questions, Gagan, to you and then to Sanjiv. Amongst major countries, India is the highest. I mean, I think Sridhar mentioned out-of-pocket expenses. Plus, nearly 63% of the treatment cost is paid by the patient and 70% of his own medicine. So, while obviously the price caps are important, but what measures can be taken by the stakeholders to ensure this balance between patient needs and industry concerns?
A very important question, and Sridhar did touch upon it when he said about the access part of it. So I think one of the things you got to realize is that pharmacy is part of the overall treatment cost. It's not a dominant part of the treatment cost. And we got to realize that, by putting price caps, what you're effectively doing is you're treating only part of the problem in the whole ecosystem. You're not treating the whole ecosystem to become patient friendly, like Sridhar touched upon. I'll give you a small example. All of us have relatives or friends in small town. If you're getting treated in a small town versus if you're getting treated in a large town, you see the difference. If you have to travel to a large town, get treated, the cost is vastly different than if you have quality healthcare available next door. So I think it's a very, very complex topic to say and try and just solve it with a price cap. You genuinely got to solve. Why do we have one of the cheapest medicines available in the world? Yeah, some of our medications, you can travel across the globe, you won't find this level of pricing. Yet we have such a high untreated population. And that kind of tells you that our ecosystem needs a fix, because it's about having access to physicians, it's about having access to that district hospital, getting treated, having stay arrangements and others available so that the overall healthcare cost comes down, and price couldn't be just one fix. I think coming to patented medication, because that's one thing which we consistently hear about. Again, you flip it around, India has one of the cheapest prices available even for patented drugs. And we got to accept that fact that most companies have a tiered policy, and when they look at India, they do introduce. Yet a large part of our population cannot afford it, and I understand that part of it. But I think what the fix is really required is in terms of having an ecosystem of healthcare insurance, which in most developing world pays for it, or having government for people who cannot afford stepping in to help, and working closely with pharmacos to develop what I call as HTA, Health Technology Assessment Models, which can effectively define what the value the drug brings in. At the end of the day, we're all getting approved, and regulatory approvals are done today based on science. They can also be done based on value, and therefore the pricing can be far more collaborative and can make a difference. So I think lastly what I'll probably say is we definitely need healthcare insurance to step in. We definitely need out of pocket to reduce, especially for what I call as OPD expenses. and long-term solutions coming out of government and partnering on HTS.
Thank you, Gagan. Sanjiv, last question to you. Biologics clearly accounts for 22% of the value globally. It's growing at CAGR of 8%. And if you look at the R&D pipeline, 66% of the spend is all on biologics. But a lot of these new drugs and treatments that is coming up is all probably outside India, uh, which basically means that it will be probably more expensive for India, right? Therefore, in this context, what is it that the pharma industry probably needs to do to make these drugs more affordable and accessible?
I think this is an important question, but I'm not dealing with the pricing issue because Gagan and Sridhar really dealt it with in great detail. But let's look at what can we do to become a biologics powerhouse, and that's probably a much bigger and important question. Clearly, why biologics have become center stage of treatment is because of better outcomes. So this is the way to go, and this is the future. Let's not go away from that. I speak from a point that we probably arguably are the premier biotech company of the country. And if we look at what's happening around us and the kind of research and investments required, we clearly see there are two parts to it. Part number one is how do we become a strong, first of all, a strong ecosystem of biosimilar companies? Because biosimilar companies, when we build capability. And it's important to do that. We have a great chance now because a lot of hurdles have been removed by EMA and US FDA. For example, toxicological studies are not required. You can negotiate getting out of phase 3 if you can prove by analytics. And there is a lot more happening from a regulatory point of view where Indian companies will be able to do a lot of research on biosimilars and get access to markets much, much quicker. And that's a great thing. So that is very important. For example, and ambition should be right. So currently we have taken an ambition that we will probably be the best company around in cell culture management. How do you build cell lines? So if we do that in a particular area, we will dominate the world in terms of the cell lines that we produce in a particular therapeutic area. So that ambition has to be right for Indian companies. Secondly, when we look at the capability that is happening, if we build this ecosystem, is the fact that we build a lot more scientists to develop newer biologics. The ability to develop newer biologics, if we build biosimilars, is not going to be very different. And therefore, the bigger issue could be the clinical part, the regulatory part. So that's a completely separate skill that we need to develop. But if we do that, we will not miss the bus as we missed the bus in the chemistry innovation that we missed as a country. Let's not at least miss the biologic bus. And it's extremely important that we start investing as companies, as governments, as academic institutions right now. If we do that, we are in for a good time. I think companies will have to make hard choices around it if they want to go this way. And if those hard choices are made, the return on investment is very, very high. So the probability of failure in biologic space is lesser than in chemistry space. This might be a big statement to make, but having seen this now, R&D for the last 3 years, if you really concentrate better, your ability to detect failure is much earlier in biologics compared to chemistry. So there is much better scope for India to join this bandwagon, and let's do it quickly.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and thanks to all. I think you can see the wealth of experience that is coming across, very practical suggestions, but I think, and all of them have the hope that India will really rise up and become the pharmacy capital of the world. Thank you, everyone, and I think, like I said, for the fellow panelists, please, if I could have a big round of applause for them.